Sir George Grey. Sir George Grey was a soldier, explorer, ethnologist, governor of 3 colonies including New Zealand, where he also served as a premier, before retiring home to England in his 80s, after a career in New Zealand at least, of distinction yet controversy. So who was George Grey? George Grey was born in Lisbon, Portugal on 14 April 1812, the son of a British Army Lieutenant Colonel. He was educated at a boarding school in Guildford before receiving military training at Sandhurst. In 1830, Grey was posted to Ireland, serving as a junior officer for 6 years. However, disliking army service and appalled by the misery inflicted on the Irish by English landlords, Grey moved to Australia, seeking to discover new lands for European settlement. During a number of expeditions into the Australian outback, Grey became fascinated by the culture of Aboriginal Australians, an ethnological interest in native peoples that would influence his later career as colonial administrator. In 1840, Grey expounded his theories on colonisation and racial assimilation to the Colonial Office in London. Suitably impressed, the Colonial Office appointed him governor of the fledgling colony of South Australia, whilst still in his 20s, where he succeeded in instituting much-needed political and social reform, though he was less successful in addressing the colony's significant race relations problems. In 1845, Grey was appointed Governor of New Zealand. As a military-trained administrator, he replaced 2 previous governors with humanitarian backgrounds. The difference was soon apparent. Grey moved quickly to abolish a protectorate established to safeguard Māori interests. He also acted quickly against the Māori tribes of the far north, insisting that Māori waging war against the Crown immediately desist, which they eventually did in 1845. Grey then faced the colony on the verge of bankruptcy, but unlike his predecessors, Grey had come to New Zealand armed with substantial funds. He also had access to a standing army, which he was prepared to use to enforce state compliance upon restive Māori, who were unhappy with the colonial assumptions emerging from the Crown colony government. Unfortunately for Grey, the land wars fought in the far north began spreading south through the country, resuming just north of Wellington in 1846. At the same time, European settlement in New Zealand was expanding rapidly, made possible in part by Grey's success in negotiating substantial land sales transacted with Māori who were not inclined to take up arms. In 1848, Grey was knighted, and in 1852 he substantially drafted the legislation enacted in London which granted constitutional independence to New Zealand. In 1853, Grey left New Zealand, following his appointment as Governor of Cape Colony in South Africa. However, whilst he was away, the incidents of war between Māori and the Crown in New Zealand intensified. Somewhat alarmed, the Colonial Office recalled Grey, sending him back to New Zealand for a second term as Governor in 1861. With his feet barely on the ground, Grey introduced a pacifying measure, a nationwide system of tribal councils through which Māori were promised meaningful degrees of self-governance. Some Māori were happy to comply, but others were not, with the incidents of warfare continuing unabated. In 1863, Governor Grey instigated a major military invasion of the tribal district just south of Auckland, known as the Waikato. His aim was to defeat the rising Māori King movement, which he interpreted as representing an untenable challenge to the sanctity of the Crown. After the invasion was over, with the tribes of the Māori King movement scattered to the south, Grey introduced punitive land confiscations aimed at Māori who had participated in the wars. As a consequence, almost 3 million acres was taken, leaving a legacy of loss and dispossession that has only recently been ameliorated. In 1865, as the Imperial troops were being withdrawn from New Zealand, Grey was instructed to establish a replacement New Zealand Defence Force, enabling settlers to organise and pay for their own defence against any lingering Māori unrest. Fearing the loss of Imperial troops, Grey refused to comply and was dismissed as governor in 1868. Gray then retired to his Auckland home, devoting time to his former interest in native cultures, working closely with a number of noted Māori scholars like Ihaka Hakuene of Ngāpuhi and Wiremu Hikairo of Ngāti Whakawe. However, missing the cut and thrust of politics, Gray entered the New Zealand Parliament in 1875, serving as Premier between 1877 and 1879. Thereafter, Gray remained active in Parliament, most notably opposing New Zealand's political union with Australia in 1891. Suffering from ill health, Gray returned to England in 1894. In 1898, he passed away in London and was buried at St Paul's Cathedral. Today, Gray is remembered as a towering figure who dominated New Zealand's 19th century politics. During that time, he generally worked well with Māori, earning their respect. However, consistent with his peers, his insistence that British sovereignty was indivisible relegated Māori to a subordinate status that, in their own country, they could not abide. The result was a war, dispossession and loss, which has, until recently at least, tainted the otherwise striking legacy of Sir George Grey.